I didn't initially experience my conflict as a sexual conflict insofar I never doubted I was male. I experienced it more as a form of detachment from my father and an aversion to him, which was concurrent with a strong attachment to my mother and my 4 sisters, all of whom were very positive influences in my life. And even if my father had not been a difficult person, he wasn't around, but even if he had been around, I wouldn't have attached to him. But the fact is, for a good part of my development into sexual identity, he was just absent, mostly because we were living at the poverty level and he was working 2 jobs. So we saw him on the weekends, but for the most part, he worked morning, noon, and night. My only source of relationship and coming into a sense of self in the context of relationship was with women and girls in my home, because I didn't have a brother. And so much of human identity is based on what Martin Buber called dialogical personalism, which is who you are as a person, your I, me, comes forward in the presence of a thou, another person, mostly an affectionate authority figure, because thou is the familiar. And the most important thous in my life were my mother, my half-sister, who was 15 years older, and then my other 3 sisters. So it was in that context of those relationships that my I, my sense of self, started coming forward. So there was no meeting place for my maleness and masculinity within that context because my father was absent. And then when he was present, he was a broken person suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a consequence of having been a prisoner of war during World War II. My friend Daniel Trobisch has talked about how mother is a circle and father is the one who draws us away from that circle. So a lot of the origins to my same-sex attraction was actually an attempt to pull away from mother because there had not been that fatherly presence to draw me into his embrace where I could identify with him and where the end process of identification is an identity. And so my identity as masculine was compromised. Not so much my identity as male. I never doubted I was a boy. There was another factor that I speak about in my book, Setting Love in Order, which was that we were immigrants and English is my second language. And so there was another barrier in my life to connecting with other little boys, which was a language barrier, and then a cultural one, because we had a European culture at home, but we were living in the US. And so much of identification with the same sex occurs in the context of play and bonding with other little boys in a troop bonding it's called. And I had an extra step in coming into troop bonding, which actually didn't happen for me until I was in the gay lifestyle, which was my first experience of connecting with other guys as guys. Homosexuality is fetishistic insofar that the object of the homosexual attraction will have certain features that the subject, the person having the attraction, uniquely defines as the same sex. So for some guys, it's older men. So there are some men who are only attracted from the time they're young boys all through their adult life until they get any help to men who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Well, that's easy to understand because that's how they perceived their fathers, or if their fathers were missing, the one positive male in their life was a distant grandfather. And so they've attached to it in a tenuous way that's highly charged. Another way that homosexual attraction sometimes forms is only toward members of the male sex who are part of another race. And so there you have someone who sees masculinity as something that is strong if it's in a white man, if the person is not Caucasian, or if it's in a person of color, if the person is Caucasian. And in other cases, it's men who are only muscular and have hair all over their body. In others, it's guys who are slim and who have only very smooth skin. So we speak about homosexuality now more in the plural, homosexualities, and we understand the attraction as one that gives an indication of what the person is trying to sort through. And so the symbolic nature of it is that somewhere in the past, there is someone who actually matches what is being presented in the fantasy. And so it's not merely a symbol, it's actually a literal object who's there in the history of the person's psyche. And so when you revisit that and you find out what is going on in that relationship, distancing, too much connection. For example, for some young men, they've been sexually abused by another young man or an older man. And what that causes is a type of trauma that freezes the image of the abuser in the heart, and the trauma elicits so much sexual tension as anxiety that the anxiety and the sexual tension goes into the memory of the abuser, and then they find themselves sexually attracted to the very types who look just like their abuser. And it's very confusing. All human sexual brokenness, if you put it into this context of object relations, then can be understood as at what stage in your development was the object who was to be a subject of warmth and relational connection, calling your true I forward. At what point did that object remain just an object and never became a subject, never became a person in relation to you? So instead of having an I-thou relationship to it, you have an I-it relationship to it. It always remains as something other. The more successful the relationship, the person is in a subject, and there's a personal bond. But if the person stays as an object, there's always that sense of relating to that person as one who's beyond reach because they're not quite human. And that's the nature of all sexual brokenness. We treat the other as a sexual object rather than a person. So whether it's the heterosexual man who's addicted to internet porn, or the homosexual man who's only attracted to one sort of man, they both have basically the same construction. The sexual attraction is to a thing who looks like a person, but it's an object. And the only difference is kind. One is of the same sex and one is of the other sex. Conrad Bars, in his book Healing the Unaffirmed, basically was speaking about the most extreme form of affirmation disorder, which is deprivation neurosis. What he showed is that in the most extreme form of the failure to attach, there is no attachment even to a person as an object. So what you have is just a person who has a big hole on the inside where everything just falls through, a kind of deprivation. And so they have no context within which to establish a relationship. They never feel connected to another human being ever. All their connection is willed. He calls it willed rapport. It all depends on where the injury is. And if the injury is early in life, it's called a primal injury, and that will cause the person to have a compromise in their ability to remain connected to another human being. And so what Bars was speaking about was not homosexuality per se, but was a type of profound narcissistic injury where there's no attachment to a person, not even on a symbolic level. And so homosexuality actually in the scales of understanding narcissistic disorders is on the lower level of the scale because the person actually wants to connect with another person and has an object of another person to connect with, which is why many gay people actually want to marry other people, want to establish a home, want to have children, because there's a great desire for connection. What Bars was talking about was the kind of deprivation neurosis that takes that away. And what you end up with is a self that is so empty, it's sometimes called the empty self, that all that is on the outside is an exterior, and the only thing that's important is how we're perceived. This is what Kohut calls the grandiose self. And you see this in people who go through one spouse after another, always looking for the younger spouse who's some kind of mirror about their beauty or success. And so you can probably think of a number of people in our society who've done that. And they never really attach to the person as person. They're always some it thing. And so they're not even sometimes all that sexually active with their spouses as much as they're just there to show. They're really concerned with how they're perceived in the public eye or how many buildings can have their names stamped on them, because their sense of self has to do all with externals. The important thing is after you deal with the object relations or the symbolic confusion, you have to then deal immediately with the narcissistic construction. And where the wound is, how deep the wound is, how much of a compromise it presents to establishing new relationships, and then help the person to establish new durable relationships, which is the context within which homosexuality and also forms of narcissism find treatment and healing. So the church has this unique context within which to offer that, because the church becomes a replacement family where you have spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers and brothers and sisters in Christ, and you have a weekly gathering where you're actually looking up to God instead of to each other, but then you have fellowship gatherings. And so it's a variety of contexts to create relationships that are durable. And what I found in the course of 25 years of ministry is the people who progress most successfully out of homosexual identification and into heterosexual identification are those who are committed to durable relationships within the context of the church and the local church at that. So they're truly known by other people. I started attending church independently, and that's where I had my first experience of how God reveals himself as one who is relational. And that was deeply imprinted in me. And I think, actually, had I stayed in that neighborhood, I would have confided in those sisters, at least, about what was happening in my home and what was happening in my heart. But when I was in the 4th grade, we moved from this immigrant neighborhood where my family of 7 was cramped into a 2-bedroom flat to the suburbs, to a 4-bedroom house. And it was there that the shift at that moment in the 4th grade, I became very much aware of how much of an outsider I still was. So the move will cause any kid to feel like he's an outsider. But I think for me, I was also sensing that I was not connecting to other little boys. And so I made friends with other little girls or other little boys who had difficulty connecting with other little boys. So my very best friend from that first day I went to school, who stayed my friend for years, he likewise had same-sex attraction develop as we later entered into puberty. And my experience in grammar school and then as I emerged into my teen years was that my sexual attractions were starting to go toward men. And at age 14, though, I then went to a Leighton Ford crusade, and there I heard the gospel preached in that Protestant evangelical way. And it was another experience of this revelation of God to me in the person of Jesus Christ, calling me to contextualize my sense of self outside myself transcendently in him, and particularly in his word. So that became a great focus for me at age 14. But at the time, the church that I was at, which was a really fine church, didn't really know what to do with anyone who was struggling homosexually. This is 1974. So I stayed in that church, but at that point I was displaying what is sometimes called gender nonconformity. And so I was effeminate, and I could tell they didn't quite know how to handle me. I wasn't really gregarious or anything like that. They just had no place. And I was there with my older sister, who was only 18 months older than me, and we went to church alone. My parents didn't attend. So after a few years of that, I stopped. I went to university and theater, and I had these great gay professors. The more I connected with my gay professors and other gay students, the more I had a sense of belonging. And in one sense, I had an experience of troop bonding at age 18 and 19 and 20 in my undergraduate years that I had never had from the time I was a little guy, never being a boy among boys. And suddenly, I was one of the guys. Some of them were really warm and nurturing relationships, particularly with two older gay men who were lovers. And they told me, don't get sucked into the gay world. A young person like you will be used sexually and then spit out. And so their answer was to get a profession, find a partner, have an open marriage, have sex buddies with your partner or on the side, but invest yourself in a career. And so I decided that would be my future. And I actually then became a voice and speech teacher in the method that they were both experts. It was the early 80s, and there was this outbreak of opportunistic infections with gays, particularly in Manhattan. And I remember being in a bar where in the course of a week, 5 of the staff got very sick and were hospitalized, and they all died within about 4 or 5 months, which was a shock. So when I left New York and came here, I was surprised with that within a year, I came down with about 12 symptoms of what was then thought to be opportunistic infections. And then I had this vision of the Lord, and I didn't know it was the Lord. And so when I said help, I saw this head and shoulders and light shining from behind. And I heard in my spirit, not with my ears, not in an auditory way, I want to heal your whole person, not just your sexuality. Choose. And then I saw myself in that hospital room on one hand, and then I saw myself on the other hand in the presence of God. So it was choose. So I obviously chose the Lord, and then I laid hands on myself for healing and fell asleep. And in the morning, my doctor came in and he said, well, we would like to do another blood test to see where your white cell count is, to see if your system can handle the bone marrow biopsy. And so they did the blood test, they counted the white cells, and my white cells had jumped into the thousands, where they had been in the double digits the night before. So he came in rather perplexed and asked me if anything had happened, and I told him no. I didn't want to talk about it. And I didn't even know it was the Lord Jesus. I mean, I had prayed to Christ, but what I saw was not this definable view of, Jesus. And it was only months later when I was in the scriptures and I was reading about the angel of the Lord and how that is a prefigurement of the incarnation of Christ in the Old Testament, that I could piece together, that's what I would have called that presence, an angel of the Lord. Therefore, it must have been Jesus. And I did pray to Jesus, and I did hear this voice speak to my spirit. And then over the period of 6 months, all my symptoms went away. I didn't quite know what to make of what had occurred. I spoke to my sister, the one who's 18 months older than I, who I used to go to church with. And she had concurrently taken a course on Christianity and homosexuality taught at her church by a Christian leader who had written a book on it called The Broken Image. I entered into a process of inner healing, which is a form of prayer ministry that uses the insights from psychology to locate where in the soul you apply the presence of God. I had the conviction now that I could repent of homosexuality, that it was a moral condition as well as an emotional and spiritual one, and so I was willing to give it up. But someone rightly discerned that I was demonized, and they laid hands on me, and they cast a whole bunch of demons out, and I didn't know they were there until they left. And each person is unique. So is it a detachment from the same sex, or is it an over-attachment to the other sex? And that can be the case for both males and females with same-sex attraction. And is there sexual abuse? If there's not sexual abuse, well, that's a different issue then. If there is, then that's another issue to deal with. Have they ever acted out? If they've never crossed the moral boundary of acting out, then they have an easier time staying within that boundary. If they have crossed that boundary, then they have to rebuild that moral boundary. So there's all these different factors, and what we offer is an 8-month voluntary pastoral care program that is not a form of therapy. We have a really high success rate. I would say of the 400 who went through our program in Chicago, I can think of maybe 10 who went back to homosexuality.